Australia's military history is filled with stories of service and sacrifice of those who have chosen to wear the uniform of their country of birth or adoption, and the legacies and values they've created. So what happens when someone falls short of these ideals? Welcome to From Duty to Dishonour, a Doc Network podcast. Let's get started. In prison cell I sadly sit, a crestfallen chappie, and own to you I feel a little bit unhappy. It really isn't a place nor time to reel off rhyming diction, but yet we'll write a final rhyme while waiting crucifixion. No matter what the end they decide, quick lime or boiling bile, sir, we'll do our best when crucified to finish off in style, sir. What we bequeath a parting tip for sound advice of such men who come across a transport ship to polish off the Dutchman. If you encounter any Boers, you really must not loot them, and if you wish to leave these shores, for pity's sake, don't shoot them. And if you earn a DSO, what every British sinner should know the proper way to go is ask the Boer to dinner. Let's toss a bumper down our throat before we pass to heaven, and toast the trim-set petticoat we leave behind in Devon. Butchered to Make a Dutchman's Holiday by Harry Harbord Morant on the date of his execution. This week, I have for you the story of Harry Morant, though most people probably know him by his infamous nickname, as evidenced by that poem I just read, known as The Breaker. This episode was originally recorded on the 24th of September 2022 for the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast, but now with the release of From Duty to Dishonour, there really is only one man that I've already covered who fits that mantle, and that is The Breaker. So let's get started. It is believed that Harry Morant was born on the 9th of December 1864 in Somerset, England, though it is difficult to properly determine his early life and upbringing, as it is generally accepted that he fabricated most of his family history and reinvented himself several times, by the time that he arrived in Townsville, northern Queensland in April 1883. He was, however, born Edwin Henry Morant, son of Edwin Morant and Catherine Morant near Riley, the owner-operators of a union workhouse in Bridgewater, and this is the name he gave when he married Daisy May O'Dwyer in Charters Towers, northern Queensland, on the 13th of March 1884. As if this story wasn't already confusing, Daisy May O'Dwyer is actually Margaret Dwyer, a renowned Irish-Australian journalist and anthropologist famous for studying Indigenous Australian culture. The marriage, however, would not last, and technically probably wasn't even legal, as Morant was allegedly only 19 at the time, not the 21 years which was the minimum. Following an acquittal for stealing pigs and a saddle, apparently Dwyer threw Morant out for also not paying for the wedding. Apparently at this point, at the recommendation of Dwyer, Morant adopts the name of Harry Harbord Morant, and it is here that it is started to claim to be the estranged son of Admiral Sir George Digby Morant, a Royal Navy Admiral, and he claims that he attended the Royal Naval College. He would travel to Winton in central West Queensland, and Dwyer moved to the region around Bathurst, central New South Wales. Morant would also go on to work as a drover. A drover is a type of horseman noted for moving large bodies of livestock, traditionally cattle, sheep, or horses, over vast distances of the country, to either deliver them to new owners, taking them to market, or to move them around during drought seasons in search of better feed or water, or to find a yard to work on them. Overlanding cattle, and it would be here at this point that he would gain the reputation for being an expert drover and horseman, gaining the nickname The Breaker for his ability to train wild horses, and under this epithet that he would start penning bush ballads for the Sydney Bulletin newspaper. For the next 15 years, he would drift between the colonies of New South Wales, Queensland, and South Australia, as at this point in history, Australia consisted of 6 self-governed colonies, with the Federation only coming into being in 1901. In this time, he gained the additional reputation of being a boozer and a womanizer, on top of the acclaim of being only one of a handful of riders capable of taming the notorious buck-jumper Dargan Grey in a horse race. During his travels, he became friends with a number of notable Australian bush poets, namely Henry Lawson, Manjo Patterson, and Will H. Ogilvie, and the group would pen a number of poems dedicated to each other during this time. In 1899, when war was declared between Britain and the 2 independent Boer states of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State in what would become known as the Second Anglo-Boer War, Morant was in South Australia, and like so many others, he had a strong connection back to the mother country. He travelled to Adelaide and volunteered for overseas service on the 27th of December 1899 with the 2nd contingent of the South Australian Mounted Rifles for a year-long deployment. It should be noted that initially only a request for assistance came from the New South Wales colony when a contingent of the New South Wales Lancers who had been training in England at the time offered their services, and due to their experience with the Martyrs' War in Egypt, it was accepted. However, the fact that the terrain and geography in South Africa is so similar to that of Australia, British authorities eventually relented and accepted offers from the other Australian colonies to join suit. Morant departed for South Africa with the second contingent on the 26th of January 1900 aboard the transport ship the SS Surrey at the rank of Lance Corporal and arrived in the Transvaal on the 25th of February. While there, his horsemanship, bushcraft, and his ability to present himself in an educated manner soon drew the attention of his superiors, resulting in him being recommended as a dispatch rider for General John French, and he would spend considerable amount of time running reports for Bennett Burleigh, the British war correspondent for the London Daily Telegraph, which apparently allowed him to have several opportunities to engage in amorous activities with nearby nurses. During his deployment, Morant participated in the Battle of Diamond Hill, which took place on the 11th of 12th of June, 1900, though the nature of his involvement is not entirely clear. He apparently did his job exceptionally well, as following his initial deployment period, he received several glowing reports and even an offer for a commission within Major General Robert Baden-Powell's Transvaal Constabulary, a paramilitary force set up to police the occupied territories of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. While he did accept the position, he instead took leave and travelled to England for 6 months, claiming he was travelling with a British Army officer, Captain Percy Hunt, who he claimed to be friends with. Now this is despite the fact that Captain Hunt was still in Pretoria, serving as a marriage commissioner at the time. Hoping to find some comfort in the upper crust of British society that he liked to pretend so hard to be a part of. While during this period of leave, however, he was allegedly engaged to be married, which would have caused some legal issues, as while his marriage to Margaret Dwyer was technically illegal, it was never actually annulled, which actually did cause some issues for Dwyer when she tried to remarry around the same time. For reasons known only to Morant, he returned to South Africa, accepting Baden-Powell's commission in the constabulary, but then decided to take that commission to the newly formed Bushveldt Carbineers on the 1st of April 1901 under the command of fellow Australian Colonel Robert Lenihan, and Australians would make up 2/5 of the unit's 350-man contingent. While the Boer states initially met the British regular forces in battle from the War of 1899 to 1900 and did enjoy a degree of success, by the end of 1900, the sheer industrial capacity of the British Empire soon played a factor, and as a result, Britain controlled most of the Boer states, save for some pockets in the northern Transvaal. So, like many other territorial powers at the time, they realised that their strength lay in familiarity with the local terrain and support from the local populace. From 1901, the Boer states started implementing small unit insurgency-style guerrilla attacks against British-controlled assets, orchestrated by units known as Commando, spelled Commando with a K. And this was actually very similar to the colonial French strategies of the British Empire, where the defense of the region was relegated to part-time soldiers that dated back. Strategy actually traced its origins back to when these regions were controlled by the Netherlands. These commandos were essentially militia units who had the advantages of being small in number, highly mobile, and not dependent on long supply lines needed by the British line infantry units. To counter this, Lord Kitchener, the commander-in-chief of all British forces in South Africa, began pursuing a policy of scorched earth, burning crops, salting fields, confiscating livestock, and forcing the entire Afrikaans population into concentration camps. In response, the Boer commandos started attacking rail lines and supply dumps more rapidly, and at a high operational tempo, in part to feed themselves, but also the Afrikaans population that was in hiding, and to also disrupt the British operations in the area. To counter this, Kitchener started using Dominion troops, particularly Australian Colonial and after the 1st of January 1901, Australian Commonwealth forces, who had similar levels of skill and bushcraft to the Boers, and who were also all mounted to counter these attacks by providing security for the more lumbering and devastating British line infantry units. To supplement this, he also ordered the formation of irregular units of his own, mainly comprised of experienced but otherwise not engaged horsemen, to fill in the gaps in the line, as more and more of his troops were being used to defend rail lines and occupy annexed Boer territory, as well as putting down local rebellions, and actually to deal with the threat caused by the Boer commandos. These irregular units were raised specifically to counter the guerrillas, to fight them at their own game, to conduct the kind of counterinsurgency role seen by modern-day special forces. However, what separates special forces troops used in conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan with these irregulars is the complete lack of additional training or any oversight. This became very evident, particularly in regard to the Bushveldt Carbineers, as they quickly gained a reputation for lawlessness, a lack of discipline, womanizing, wanton drunkenness, and alleged murders. This kind of behaviour was common amongst the irregulars, but was not universal. What is also noted about the Carbineers is that they were apparently also extremely effective in combat, and this was primarily due to level of experience within the unit, and the level of this effectiveness also gave them a degree of leniency with authorities. While in the unit, Morant enjoyed a large degree of success, though most of 1901, when the unit was engaged in patrol duties and security operations, Morant took part in the capture of 30 Boer commandos in 3 separate operations. By mid-July, after some misconduct at Fort Edward, the commander of the Carbineers A Squadron was recalled to Cape Town in disgrace, and Captain Percy Hunt was sent to assume command. Along with him was Morant and 60 men of B Squadron to, quote, sort A Squadron out, unquote. And Morant, along with a fellow officer, Lieutenant Hancock, reinstituted rather harsh discipline on the detachment, which apparently didn't gain Morant any fans within the contingent. However, whatever they did to sort them out seemed to work, as the squadron was once again out on patrol within Boer-controlled Transvaal territory and captured 18 Boers, 500 cattle, and 15 wagons, in operations not that dissimilar to the kind of fighting that was undertaken in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 21st century by SAS and commando forces. While it is entirely possible that Hunt and Morant actually knew each other back when Morant claimed to back in 1900, but by the 2nd of August 1901, it was clear that the two men knew each other and were friendly, as on the 6th of August, Captain Hunt was killed following an ambush while participating in an ill-advised and poorly planned action to capture a local commando leader, Veldkornet Barend Villian of the Labetta Commando. That was an operation within their area of responsibility. After the pandemonium of the engagement, both sides retreated, leaving the fallen where they fell. Because the slain were left where they fell, Captain Hunt's body would later be found stripped, his neck broken, his face stomped in by a hobnailed boot, and his legs slashed open with a knife. Almost immediately, the Bushveldt Carbineers, or BVC, accused the Boers of mutilating their war dead, a claim that the Boers refuted, and threw the claim back at the British as their own dead were similarly disfigured. Contemporary historians do point out that it was most likely the Lobedo witch doctors participating in traditional practices to release the warrior spirits of the dead and dying, a practice that both sides would have been aware of. That didn't matter to Morant, who, according to a fellow officer, Lieutenant Whitten, came, quote, like a man demented, unquote, and immediately assumed command of the detachment. His first order was to have every available man out on patrol to find those responsible, even apparently breaking down in tears as he informed the men of Captain Hunt's death. It is here that Fort Edward's intelligence officer, Captain Alfred Taylor, ordered that no quarter be given to avenge the combat death of their commanding officer. Despite the closeness that Morant apparently had with Hunt, he didn't actually see his body firsthand, arriving an hour after the funeral and questioned those in attendance about what had happened, and in doing so, convinced himself that Hunt had been murdered in cold blood and vowed to take no prisoners. Lieutenant Whitten alleges at this point that Morant then declared that he had, on occasion, ignored Captain Hunt's order to not kill prisoners of war in the past, and he would do so again. On the 9th of August 1901, 7 days following the death of Captain Hunt, Morant ordered a detachment to guard Reverend Rauter's mission from revenge attacks from local commandos, before leading a detachment back to the Viljoen farmhouse, and after finding it abandoned, tracked down the local Letaba commandos for the remainder of the day, eventually locating the commander's encampment in a gully that evening. According to troopers who were present at the time, Morant refused to close on the encampment, an act that would have potentially captured the whole contingent, instead opting to fire from a distance, resulting in all bar one commando escaping, leaving Flossie Visa, who had been wounded and thus unable to walk or ride, to be taken prisoner. Visa would be interrogated for 2 days by Morant as the patrol moved in regards to questions relating to commando movements and more specifically the death of his friend, and translated through trooper Thaddeus Botha, Morant's Afrikaans adjutant officer. Each interrogation session, Morant would tell Visa, quote, if you tell me the truth, your life will be spared. If you tell lies, you'll be shot, unquote. Visa informed Morant that Captain Hunt had been killed in a fair fight, shot through the chest, and when Morant challenged him as to why Hunt's neck was broken, Visa vehemently denied it. Contemporary forensic historians have speculated that the reason why Captain Hunt's neck was broken was probably due to him falling on concrete steps after he'd been shot. Quote, he then asked as to the plans of the Boers. Visa replied that the commandos were leaving the region to join another unit, unquote. After about 15 miles, Morant, along with Lieutenants Hancock and Picton, decided to hold a court-martial to decide on Visa's involvement in the killings of Captain Hunt, though to call it anything other than a drumhead or kangaroo court would be a generous description of what had happened, as Visa would not be present for his trial and was summarily convicted and sentenced to death by firing squad. When Trooper Botha delivered the result of the court-martial to Visa, he tried to remind Morant of his promise to spare his life if he answered all his questions, to which Morant said, quote, it is idle talk, we are going to shoot you, unquote. Apparently, the men of the patrol objected to the orders to execute Visa, and only did so due to the fear that if they'd raised any objections, they would have joined Visa in front of it. As Visa was invalided, he had to be lifted out of a cart, wrapped in a blanket to be propped up to a seated position to have his execution carried out. Morant then approached one of his troopers in the firing squad and said, quote, "I know it's hard times for him, but it's got to be done. See how the Boers knocked Captain Hunt about? And that it was unfortunate that he should be the first to suffer," unquote. Despite further protests by the men under his command, the execution was carried out with Lieutenant Picton delivering the coup de grace. So incensed by this deed, a number of troopers tore their BVC patches from their tunics before returning to Fort Edward. Visa was buried in a shallow grave alongside the Kudeos River, and when the patrol returned to the fort, they participated in the fort's defense during an attack by a strong Boer force. As expected, when the word of Visa's execution became public knowledge, the fallout was immediate, and black Afrikaans refused to cooperate with British forces, resulting in several being shot for insubordination. On the 20th of August 1901, 8 Boer prisoners surrendered to British forces near the Swiss-run Elam Hospital, and a patrol was sent out to bring them back to the fort. Before departing, the patrol leader was reminded of a standing order issued by Morant that no more prisoners were to be brought on the grounds of diminishing rations. Instead, the patrol took the prisoners to the hospital, where Lieutenants Morant, Hancock, and Whitten, plus 4 other ranks, were waiting for them. Morant at this time took personal command over the prisoners and ordered the initial patrol to return to Fort Edward as an advance guard in response to claims of Boer activity in the area. While the column was preparing to depart, Reverend Karl August Daniel Hesse, a German Lutheran missionary, recognized one of the Boer prisoners to be a Dutch schoolmaster who had been working at his mission station. In fact, of the 8 prisoners, only 8 were Afrikaans. The remainder were Dutch teachers who had been working in the Transvaal, under contract from Amsterdam. As Hesse spoke with the prisoners, he became increasingly aware of how worried they were about their fate, despite surrendering voluntarily. This interaction apparently angered the BVC guards, who ordered the missionary to join them as another prisoner. Hesse refused, but stated that he would present himself to the fort with a documentation that allowed him to travel freely throughout the region. Along the return trip to Fort Edward, it would seem that a prearranged plan to fake a Boer attack on the column, which served as a cover to shoot the prisoners, took place. Afterwards, all 8 victims were buried in a mass grave. Although the allegation stood that all 8 victims were commando members, in reality, probably only 4 of the 5 of them were. About a week later, on the 26th or 27th of August, reports began to circulate that Reverend Hesse, who had been found shot on the Petersburg Road about 15 miles from the fort on his way to Petersburg, where he was apparently going to report on the activities of Morant and his group to the British authorities. Before that point, it seems that Hesse had been detained at Fort Edward for several weeks. Despite the claims that the Boers were responsible, British authorities had a hard time believing this, as missionaries were well respected within the Transvaal, which is what allowed them to travel freely throughout the area. By this time, rumours started appearing in Petersburg of the behaviour of the Carbineers, which sparked an investigation from Captain Frederick Betrodano, the district intelligence officer based in Pretoria. However, he encountered difficulty getting information from the fort, as the quote-unquote telegraph line repeatedly would be out of order, which was apparently a common occurrence when the officers in the fort didn't particularly want to communicate with higher authorities. To counter this, Captain Bertadano dispatched, quote, 2 splendid native scouts, unquote, to secretly interview the black Afrikaans who worked as servants of the BVC and Captain Taylor's staff. After 9 days, one of the scouts returned and brought back information about the murders of several groups of Boer Prisoners of War and the assassination of Reverend Hesse. The later killings had been committed, according to the boys, at Fort Edward by Lieutenant Hancock under orders from Morant. Historians have speculated that had Hesse not been assassinated, it would have been unlikely that any members of the Bushveldt Carbineers would have gone to trial. And only the reason why the fact that it did was because he was a foreign national. Even after this discovery, Morant, acting on a report that 3 armed Boer commandos were travelling to the fort, he took Hancock and several other men to intercept them. After the Boers surrendered with a white flag, they were allegedly taken prisoner, disarmed, and then shot. Later the same day, Colonel Lenihan, the commander of the Bushveldt Carbineers, arrived at Fort Edward on a rare visit. Morant persuaded Lenihan to let him command a strong patrol out to search for a small Boer unit commanded by Field Cornet Kelly, an English Boer commander whose farm was in the district. Kelly had fought against the British in main actions of the war, and after returning to his home, he'd become a commando rather than surrender. Morant's patrol left Fort Edward on the 16th of September 1901 with orders from Lenihan that Kelly and his men were to be captured and brought back alive if possible. Covering the 130 miles or 210 kilometers in a week of hard riding, they left their horses 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers away from Kelly's encampment and went the rest of the way on foot. During the early hours of the next morning, Morant's patrol charged, this time taking the Boers completely by surprise. Morant himself arrested Kelly at gunpoint at the door to his tent. A week later, they returned to Fort Edward with Kelly's party and then escorted them safely to Petersburg. The British Commandant, Colonel Hall, sent Morant a message congratulating him on the success of the mission, after which Morant took 2 weeks' leave to settle the affairs of Captain Hunt. On the 4th of October 1901, a letter signed by 15 members of the Bushveldt Carbineers garrison at Fort Edward was dispatched secretly to Colonel F.H. Hall, the British Army officer commanding at Petersburg. Written by BVC trooper Robert Mitchell Cochrane, a former Justice of the Peace from Western Australia, the letter accused members of the Fort Edward garrison of 6 quote-unquote disgraceful incidents. The incidents were 1. The shooting of 6 surrendered Afrikaner men and boys and the theft of their money and livestock at Valdenzia on the 2nd of July 1901. The orders had been given by Captains Alfred Taylor and James Huntley Robertson and relayed by Sergeant Major KCB Morrison to Sergeant DC Oldham. The actual killing was alleged to have been done by Sergeant Oldham and BVC troopers Eden, Arnold, Brown, Heath and Dale. 2. The shooting of BVC trooper BJ Van Bruin by BVC Lieutenant Peter Hancock on the 4th of July 1901. Trooper Van Bruin, an Afrikaner, had, quote, disapproved, unquote, of the killings at Valdenzia and had informed the victims' wives and children who were imprisoned at Fort Edward of what had happened. 3. The revenge killing of Floris Visa, a wounded prisoner of war near Cocados River on the 11th of August 1901. Visa had been captured by a BVC patrol led by Lieutenant Morant 2 days before his death. After Visa had been exhaustively interrogated and conveyed for 15 miles by the patrol, Lieutenant Morant had ordered his men to form a firing squad and shoot him. The squad consisted of BVC troopers A.J. Petrie, J.J. Gill, Wild, and T.J. Bota. A coup de grace was delivered by BVC Lieutenant Harry Picton. The slaying of Floris Visa was in retaliation to the combat deaths of Morant's close friend, BVC Captain Percy Frederick Hunt, at Duvezkov on the 6th of August 1901. Number 4. The shooting, ordered by Captain Taylor and Lieutenant Morant, of 4 surrendered Afrikaners and 4 Dutch schoolteachers who had been captured at the Elam Hospital in Valdezia on the morning of the 23rd of August 1901. The firing squad consisted of BVC Lieutenant George Whitten, Sergeants D.C. Oldham, Troopers J.T. Arnold, Edward Brown, T. Dale, and A. Heath, although Trooper Cochrane's letter made no mention to the fact that 3 native South African witnesses were also shot dead. 5. The ambush and fatal shooting of Reverend Carl August Daniel Hesser of the Berlin Missionary Society near Bandelierkop on the afternoon of the 23rd of August 1901. Reverend Hesser had spiritually counseled the Dutch and Afrikaner victims that morning and had angrily protested to Lieutenant Morant at Fort Edward upon learning of their deaths. Trooper Cochrane alleged that the killer of Reverend Hesser was BVC Lieutenant Peter Hancock, although Cochrane made no mention of the fact that Reverend Hesser's driver, a member of the Southern Nebdel people, was also killed. Number 6. The orders given by BVC Lieutenant Charles H.D. Hannam to shoot a wagon train containing Afrikaner women and children who were coming in to surrender at Fort Edward on the 5th of September 1901. The ensuing gunfire caused the deaths of 2 boys aged 5 and 13 years and the wounding of a 9-year-old girl. The shooting of Rolf van Staden and his sons Rolf and Christian near Fort Edward on the 7th of September 1901. All were coming in to surrender in the hope of gaining medical treatment for teenaged Christian, who was suffering from recurring bouts of fever. Instead, they were met at the Sweetwaters farm near Fort Edward by a party consisting of Lieutenants Morant and Hancock, joined by BVC Sergeant Major Hammett, Corporal McMahon, and Troopers Hodds, Bota, and Thompson. Rolf van Staden and both his sons were then shot, allegedly after being forced to dig their own graves. The letter then accused the field commander of the BVC, Colonel Robert Lanahan, of being, quote, privy to these misdemeanors, unquote, which explained why these men bypassed their local command. After listing numerous civilian witnesses who could confirm their allegations, Trooper Cochrane concluded, quote, Sir, many of us are Australians who have fought throughout nearly the whole war, while others are Afrikaans who have fought from Colenso till now. We cannot return home with the stigma of these crimes attached to our names. Therefore, we humbly pray that a full and exhaustive inquiry be made by imperial officers in order that truth be elicited and justice done. Also, we beg that all witnesses may be kept in camp in Petersburg until the inquiry is finished. So deeply do we deplore the opprobrium which must be inseparably attached to these crimes that scarcely a man, once his time is up, can be prevailed to re-enlist in this corps, trusting for the credit of thinking you'll grant the inquiry we seek, unquote. In response to the letter written by Trooper Cochrane, Colonel Hall summoned all Fort Edward officers and non-commissioned officers to Petersburg on the 21st of October 1901. All were met by a party of mounted infantry 5 miles or 8 kilometers outside of Petersburg on the morning of the 23rd of October 1901 and, quote, brought into town like criminals, unquote. Morant was arrested after returning from leave in Pretoria by Captain de Bertadano, who took personal interest in arresting Morant and apparently taking great pleasure in the fact that he was responsible for Morant going to trial. He also, quote, failed to recognize Morant as a brother officer, stating that he was guilty as all hell and he enjoyed being the agent that delivered him there, unquote. Of the officers and NCOs of the BVC that had been summoned before Colonel Hall, 6 would face trial by court-martial on the charges outlined by Trooper Cochrane. They would be Colonel Lanahan, commanding officer of the Bushveldt Carbineers, Captain Alfred Taylor, the base intelligence officer, and Lieutenants Picton, Whitten, Hancock, and Breaker Morant. Unfortunately, a lot of the trial transcripts and courts of inquiry, like a lot of official files from between 1850 and 1914, were lost either by civil service statute or destroyed by the German Luftwaffe during the Blitz on London in the Second World War. What we do know, though, about these trials comes from the summaries that appeared in the Times of London and the memoirs of Lieutenant George Whitten. In response to Trooper Cochrane's letter, a military court of inquiry was convened on the 16th of October 1901 under Colonel H.M. Carter as president of the court. A military court of inquiry is a type of tribunal appointed to investigate a matter and decide whether or not a court-martial was warranted. This inquiry ran for 6 weeks to deliberate and determine if there was enough evidence to go to trial, and the findings of that court determined there was enough evidence for charges to be laid on 6 of the 7 incidents, indicting 6 officers of the BVC. Morant himself would face 4 separate charges of, quote, while on active service committing the offence of murder, unquote. This was in relation to the execution of Floris Visser, the murder of the 8 Dutch and Boer prisoners near Elam Hospital, the assassination of Reverend Hieser, and the execution of 3 Boers who surrendered to BBC forces outside Fort Edward in the hope of seeking medical care. According to the official report from the British War Office, Morant was either the primary instigator or directly responsible for the murder of approximately 12 to 20 Boers over those 4 separate incidents. However, Morant and his co-accused wouldn't initially be aware of the charges placed against them. They were all placed in solitary confinement from the point that they were arrested in October to the time of the first court-martial being conveyed on the 16th of January 1902. Major James Francis Thomas, a solicitor from Tenterfield, New South Wales and a member of the New South Wales Mounted Rifles, had been initially retained to represent Colonel Lanahan, who had to travel to Petersburg on short notice. But as all 6 accused were almost exclusively Australian, both Picton and Taylor were British, and technically Morant was as well, he agreed to represent all of them. However, as Morant was not interested in leaving his fate to a quote-unquote bush lawyer, he apparently opted to speak for himself, which probably didn't help his chances any. The first court-martial was conveyed in secret, which was contrary to regulations that all court-martials were to be held out in the open and accessible to civilians. And this was relating to the execution of Visser, and began on the 16th of January 1902 with the 4 left Morant, Hancock, Picton and Whitten, though each man was tried separately. This hearing was conducted at the Petersburg Blockhouse in relatively relaxed conditions. Morant's main defense was that he'd been following orders, that no prisoners were to be taken, and that he'd been simply following orders, a defense that is now known as the Nuremberg defense, made infamous by the defense made by Nazi officers for war crimes trials following the Second World War. He claimed that these orders came from Captain Hunt, as repeated by Captain Taylor, based on standing but unwritten orders from Lord Herbert Kitchener, the Commander-in-Chief of British and Dominion forces. While this would have been his defense in all 4 court-martials, it could not be corroborated and Morant would be found guilty of murder, while Hancock, Whitten and Picton would be charged with manslaughter. The proceedings were interrupted on the 23rd of January as a Boer attack on the Petersburg blockhouses resulted in Morant and his co-accused being released and issued arms in order to participate in the defense. Apparently, they fought bravely and in direct line of fire and assisted in repelling the attack. Major Thomas, in response to this act, filed a plea of condonation based on a memorandum of corporal punishment issued by the Duke of Wellington back in 1832, relating to, quote, the performance of a duty of honour or of trust after the knowledge of an offence committed by a soldier, or to convey a pardon for the offence, unquote. This meant that because the men were acting with honour in the defence of the blockhouse from a Boer attack, that they should be pardoned for the crimes they'd been charged. The plea was promptly dismissed. A second court-martial was conveyed on 31st of January 1902 and focused on the murder of the Boer and Dutch prisoners at Elam Hospital. During the course of this court-martial, Morant stuck to his defence of following orders, of not bringing prisoners back to the fort. However, the large number of depositions by members of the BVC being made, giving damning evidence against the accused, resulted in Morant, Hancock and Whitten being found guilty. Soon after the second hearing, probably as a result of the Boer attack, the prisoners were put in irons and taken to Pretoria while under heavy guard, and tried for the third main count, that of killing Reverend Hesse. Despite the evidence being presented, no guilt could be found for either Morant or Hancock, who were the only two officers charged with the Reverend's murder. While this was the case, he was however found guilty of ordering troopers under his command to execute Rolf van Staden and his sons, who had surrendered in the hope of receiving medical attention. Due to the guilty verdicts for Wiese and the 8 Boers killed near the Elam Hospital, Morant and Hancock would be, on the 24th of February 1902, sentenced to death. For their own crimes, Whitten would be sentenced to life in prison, Picton would be cashiered or ritually dismissed in disgrace, Lanahan was forced to resign and sent back to Australia, and all charges against Taylor would be dropped. In response to these court-martials, the entirety of the Bushveldt Carbineers would be disbanded, much to the joy of Captain de Bertadano. It is said that Captain Robertson, the disgraced former commanding officer of A Squadron, Bushveldt Carbineers, who had been replaced by Captain Hunt and thus put this entirety of these events in play, was personally handed Morant's and Hancock's execution orders from Lord Kitchener, where he allegedly said, quote, "Think yourself lucky that you're not amongst them," unquote. As preparations were being made to carry out these sentences, Major Thomas frantically attempted to appeal to Lord Kitchener, even to King Edward VII, only to find these sentences had already been confirmed and no clemency would be offered. Morant and Hancock had once requested writing materials and apparently wrote letters to Kitchener, family members in Australia, and the Australian government, as well as drafts of telegrams. By accounts, some of this mail was detained in Pretoria, though certain letters apparently did arrive at their destinations. On the 26th of February, as the day wore on, the prisoners could hear the sound of coffins being built. Shortly afterwards, Whitten was told that he and Picton would be leaving the next morning, bound for England. Lanahan had already left Cape Colony, and Taylor was a free man. That night, Morant, Picton, Hancock, and Whitten had a last supper together at Morant's request. He and Hancock were allowed to spend their last night in the same cell. Morant would spend most of the night writing and then penned a final sardonic verse, which he titled "Butchered to Make a Dutchman's Holiday." He also wrote a confession stating that he'd killed the Boers that he believed had killed Captain Hunt. At 0500 hours on the 27th of February, Whitten and Picton were taken away and were allowed to say a brief farewell to Morant and Hancock, but were only allowed to do so through the small gate in the cell door, and they clasped hands. Shortly before 0600, Morant and Hancock were led out to the fort at Pretoria to be executed by firing squad from the King's Own Cameron Highlanders. Both men refused to be blindfolded. Morant gave his cigarette case to the squad leader, and his last words were either, quote, "Shoot straight, you bastards, don't make a mess of this," unquote, or, quote, "Take this thing, the blindfold, off," unquote. And on its removal, quote, "But you make sure of a good job of it," unquote. Lieutenant Harry Harbord, the Breaker Morant, was 37 years old at the date of his execution. His body was buried alongside Lieutenant Peter Hancock in the Church Street Cemetery in Pretoria, South Africa, under the inscription, quote, "A man's foes shall be those of his own household," unquote. Morant is commemorated on several memorials: the Bow Desert Lieutenant Harry Breaker Morant Memorial in Queensland, the Burke and District War Memorial, the Bogan Gate War Memorial, the Colston Lakes Memorial Hall, the South African Boer War Memorials in Bathurst and Oaksley, and the Tilpa War Memorials in New South Wales, and calls as recently as August of 2024 have been made to have him included in the Adelaide City Boer War Memorial. However, Breaker Morant's story does not end with his execution. The Australian government was apparently not informed of the court-martial until the day of the sentence being carried out, and only found out about it when it was announced in March 1902, and only after requesting the particulars of the case to Lord Kitchener, who responded in a telegram to the Australian Governor-General on the 5th of April, and it was published in full in Australian papers. This telegram caused an uproar in Australia, where it was generally believed that Kitchener suppressed the court-martials, namely due to the fact that the only 2 officers were found guilty were Australian. This gave rise to the belief that Morant and Hancock were scapegoats, or had been sacrificed due to their status of being quote-unquote colonials. This was compounded following the release of Whitten's memoir in 1907, following the commuting of his life sentence, following by an extensive letter-writing campaign. Morant's execution had much longer-reaching and immediate legal implications, as Morant and Hancock would go into history as the first subjects of the British Empire to be tried and convicted of a war crime, namely that of murdering a surrendered prisoner of war. Their executions would also influence Australian military policy, as when the 1903 Defence Act was put into law, following a review from Lord Kitchener on Australia's ability to defend itself, and what consolidated the colonial forces into a national defence force, it contained provisions within it that limited the offences of which death sentences could be imposed by court-martial and required such sentences to be confirmed by the Governor-General of Australia. This prevented Australian service personnel from being under total foreign legal command ever again, and this act also prevented over 150 Australians who had been sentenced to death in the First World War from being executed. Almost immediately following his death, Morant was elevated to the status of folk hero, placing him along other infamous figures like Ned Kelly. This status would result in a number of plays and books being written about him or the trial, culminating in a 1980s movie titled Breaker Morant, which portrayed the titular character as a scapegoat charged to deflect attention away from the deeds carried out by a superior. The narrative of Harry the Breaker Morant still continues to this day, with a number of legal and political attempts by people and groups even as recently as 2024 to try and have him pardon of his crimes. To date, all have been unsuccessful. Back when I originally wrote this episode in September of 2022, I probably found it's the hardest one to write, mainly because it was very hard for me to separate the man, Harry Harbord Morant, and the myth that is Breaker Morant, as evidenced by his positioning within the public zeitgeist of Australia. But, that being said, is that he definitely fills in the category of someone who was doing their job until they didn't. And that is why he's here. But let me know in the comments what you thought, and remember to get more episodes like this, check out patreon.com/IWODMJ. Thanks for listening to From Duty to Dishonour, an Australian military history podcast. It is a monthly backer-only podcast, unless I decide to share it with the public. So if you like what you heard today and you want to know more, head over to patreon.com/IWODMJ for more like this and other exclusive content. Now, if you want to continue the conversation or suggest the topic of a future episode, you can also do that on all our social media channels. At this point, the podcast network is on everything at IWODMJ. If you want to join the Armoured Emu Brigade community, you can do so on our Discord server. The invite link to that is in the episode description and on the website www.the.network.net. Thanks for listening to From Duty to Dishonour, an Australian military history podcast, a .network production. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, whose elders have passed on knowledge for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This podcast is mostly a one-man show, with me doing the writing, researching, recording, audio engineering, and directing, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. All opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker, and do not represent the opinions or views of any agency, entity, or organization. Intro and outro themes by Pavel Burakov of Pixabay. This podcast is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. But until next time, friends, catch you then. Bye.